Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Jorge Mena, Associate Director at the Rafael Cintrón Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in this Zona Abierta online program, and many thanks to our co-sponsors, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Engagement, and the College of Urban Planning and Policy for supporting this program. Zona Abierta is a Latino Cultural Center program series which highlights the intersection of arts, humanities, science, culture, and civic life with presentations by local, national, and international artists, scholars, and community leaders about pressing social and environmental issues affecting the lives of Latinxes and Latin Americans while making connections to other communities. Today's program is the first of 3 presentations that the LCC is hosting this semester for a continued series titled Radical Research from BIPOC Scholars at UIC, with scholars who joined the Bridge to Faculty program at UIC. They will be sharing their experiences and respective research through an intersectional lens, revealing the complexity and particularity of their research and how their lives of those in the margins are impacted. For those of you who may be unaware, the Bridge to Faculty program is a recruitment initiative in the Office of Diversity. This program is designed to attract underrepresented postdoctoral scholars with the goal of a direct transition to a tenure-track junior faculty position after 2 years. This is also the second installment of this series, as we hosted 4 speakers in the spring of 2022. And you can view all 4 previous presentations on our LCC YouTube, which we will share the link to that within the chat. Today's presentation by Dr. David López-García will focus on his new book, Worker Mobility and Urban Policy in Latin America, Policy Interactions and Urban Outcomes in Mexico City, as a way to introduce his broader research agenda. Through this book, Dr. López-García examines and provides a comprehensive look at urban inequalities resulting from economic development, transport, and housing policies in the Mexico City Metropolitan Zone. Today's presentation will be about 35 to 40 minutes, followed by a short conversation facilitated by the LCC's program coordinator, Jocelyn Munguia Chavez. We invite you to put comments and questions on the chat so that Jocelyn can direct those to our speaker. Now, I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. David López-García is doing his postdoctoral work in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy. After serving as visiting lecturer in the Urban Studies Department at Queens College, CUNY, and as a visiting research scholar in the Observatory on Latin America at the New School. Dr. David López-García received his PhD in Public and Urban Policy from the New School, and his research in part looks at how inequalities and accessibility to jobs within urban regions are produced and sustained. In this way, he examines who has access to which kind of jobs and why. Thus, his work spans across themes of urban accessibility, urban structure, commuting inequalities, and policy mobilities. He has conducted research in cities in the US, in Mexico, Bolivia, China, Uganda, and Tanzania. And his postdoctoral research project examines inequalities of accessibility to jobs mediated by race and socioeconomic characteristics in cities across the US and selected cities in the Global South. As I said, David's book, titled Worker Mobility and Urban Policy in Latin America, Policy Interactions and Urban Outcomes in Mexico City, is a result of his doctoral dissertation and was recently published by Routledge. Congratulations and welcome. Bienvenido, David.
Thank you. Gracias, Jorge. First of all, thank you for the invitation to the Latino Cultural Center. I am very happy to be here, and thank you for the introduction, Jorge. And well, let's get started. All right. What I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna share my screen, and this presentation is gonna be a book talk, right? And the book is titled Worker Mobility and Urban Policy in Latin America, Policy Interactions and Urban Outcomes in Mexico City. And what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to try to invite everyone to read the book, right? Or at least a chapter of the book. This book is already available in the university library in its digital version. So you can just go ahead and download it with your university credentials. I'm going to do a brief outline of this talk. I'm going to start by doing a very brief overview of the book. I'm going to try to explain the relevance and the main contributions of the book. I'm going to do a very brief description of the book chapters, because then I do want to spend a little more time on one specific chapter of the book, chapter 3, that is titled Diverging Mobility Situations of Workers in Greater Mexico City. And then we can open it up for a Q&A, all right? So let's start with an overview of the book, right? So this was my doctoral dissertation that I did at the New School. I finished my PhD in the summer of 2021, and then I started working with an editor at Routledge, and we transformed the dissertation into a book. I had to streamline the entire chapters of the dissertation, and I added one more chapter that is completely new to the book. So in total, the book is 133 pages, 7 chapters, 1 annex, and 1 postscript. By the way, the postscript is about what does it mean to research the mobility experience of workers over a pandemic, right? So I think it's a nice postscript for this kind of work. In total, the book has 14 maps, 12 tables, 11 figures. And to write this book, I had to do preliminary field work in Mexico City over the summer of 2016 and 2017, right? When I was being a PhD student, I would use my summers to go to Mexico City and just, to taste the waters and try to identify the entry point for my dissertation. And then a little bit down the road, I did the actual field work for the book over the fall of 2018. I did a research stay in the National Autonomous Mexican University at UNAM. And then over the spring break and summer of 2019, I went back to Mexico City for the specific pieces of empirical work that I was missing to complete the book. And in total, I was able to conduct 64 in-depth interviews, 4 focus groups, and a good amount of statistical and spatial analysis that I'm going to show in a minute. All right. What is the relevance and the main contributions of this book? And this is my sales pitch, right? I'm going to try to convince everyone to go and check out the book in the library and take a look at it. First of all, what I'm trying to do with this book is that I am trying to advance the field of urban policy as a policy domain. You see, the thing is that the way we do policy analysis today is mainly based in a sectoral approach, right, that subdivides the urban complexity into individual silos, right, in order to be able to analyze it and understand it. So for instance, the housing specialists, they think about housing. The transportation specialists, they think about transportation, right? The economic development specialists, they think about jobs and urban development, and so forth, right? And we do all these urban policy analysis, borrowing analytical lenses and borrowing theories and analytical tools from the field of public policy. There's many theories in public policy that we learn in the classroom, and then we try to apply them to the complexity of cities, right? But this is problematic because these frameworks, right, these analytical lenses, however useful they are, and they are really useful, they're not designed specifically to deal with the complexity of urban regions, right? And this is where I come in with my book, because in this work, what I'm trying to do is to develop analytical lenses that are inspired by and designed specifically for the analysis of urban policy, right? Because policies in cities, policies from what we could think as seemingly distinct policy areas, right? Housing, transport, economic development, public safety, public health, so forth. All of those policies, they actually overlap in urban space and interact in ways that we are still lacking analytical lenses to really understand, right? They interact, and sometimes they produce unintended consequences. And this is what I'm trying to do with the book, right? Analytical lenses able to deal with how policies overlap and interact in urban space. So in order to do that, The second contribution of the book is that I designed and I proposed something that I called the policy interactions framework, right? That precisely provides analytical lens to look at the long-term interaction of policies from what we could consider seemingly distinct policy domains, but they actually overlap in space and interact, right? So this framework is designed for the empirical study of those interactions in the long term over urban space. I call it the policy interactions framework, and it's explained and developed in chapter 2 of the book. And then I apply the policy interactions framework to the study of what shapes the mobility experience of workers in Mexico City, right? I look at 3 streams of policies: economic development policies that explain agglomerations of jobs concentrations. I look at housing policies that looks at, that explains the spatial distribution of workers in the residential location throughout an urban region. And I look at transportation policy, right, that explains how workers are connected to their jobs in cities, right? So I look at the interactions between those 3 kinds of policies over time in Mexico City Metropolitan Zone. And as an outcome of that, I'm proposing in the concluding chapter of the book something that I call the choiceless mobility hypothesis, right? Which is basically a process by which the long-term interaction between economic development policies, housing policies, and transport policies are consistently increasing the physical separation between workers and jobs, commodifying and fragmenting transport systems, and increasingly producing a higher commuting cost for workers, right? I explain this choiceless mobility hypothesis in the concluding chapter, and I develop it in depth, all right? So if anyone wants to take a look at what am I talking about there, what is this about, please take a look at the concluding chapter of the book. It's absolutely available in the library, all right? So how did I do this? I look at the case study of Mexico City Metropolitan Zone, right? This is Mexico City Metropolitan Zone. Is a tri-state area with 22 million people. It's a monster of urban region comprised of 76 different municipalities, and marvelous, complex, and interesting, right? Fascinating. So I went there to try to understand it. This is a map of socioeconomic status that I developed and explained in the introduction of the book. And as you can see, higher socioeconomic status concentrates towards the center and the west of the metropolitan region, but the eastern part of the region and the peripheral areas are mostly medium, low, and very low socioeconomic status, right? And specifically, I looked at a sub-region of Mexico City Metropolitan Zone that everyone knows as Eastern Mexico City, which is an area famously known for being a dormitory city, where it is believed that most people commute from that area into the main job concentrations in the city, only to get back in the evening and just to spend the night there so that they could go back to their work, right? It's an area with very low transportation networks, and with very few jobs available for the population that lived there, right? So it was a wonderful case study to try to analyze how these regions of low accessibility to jobs and high commuting costs are produced and sustained. So let me just explain the table of content of the book very briefly before moving to the specific chapters, right? The book starts with an introduction where I problematize this interaction between different policies and how they can produce inequalities in the commuting experience of workers over time. I explain the relevance of the research in the book, and I advance the methodology and the main findings of the book and the contributions, right? And I also explain the structure of the book. Then chapter 2 develops the analytical framework, the policy interactions framework, which is the framework that I use for the research, right, for the empirical study. I draw on theories of urban political economy and a theory of the policy process that we call policy feedback theory. And based on those two bodies of literature, I ensemble my own analytical lens, right? The one that I'm calling the policy interactions framework, designed to, conduct empirical work about how the outcomes of the political economy within one policy domain, like economic development or transport or housing, whatever is the outcome of those policy domains, can loop back and produce feedback effects into another kind of policy domain, right? What I'm saying is that what happens in transport policy can have a feedback loop into what happens in housing. And what happens through housing policy can have a feedback loop into what happens in economic development policy, and so on and so forth, right? So please take a look at the chapter and you'll see what I'm talking about. Then I go ahead with 4 empirical studies. A first study about mapping the mobility situations of workers in Greater Mexico City, and this is a chapter that I'm going to explain more in depth in a minute. Then I do another chapter to look at shifts in the spatial location of the demand for labor in the urban region. Then I take a look at housing pathways, right? The housing strategies that are available for workers in Mexico City Metropolitan Zone and how that relates to their mobility experience. And then I take a look at something that I call public and common mobility resources, which is basically a methodology to map and assess the distribution of publicly funded mobility resources for workers, right? And then based on those 3 empirical chapters, I move to the concluding section of the book where I apply the policy interactions framework to the study of those 4 empirical chapters. And then I propose and develop the choiceless mobility hypothesis. Again, the choiceless mobility hypothesis, which I define as the process that consistently increases transportation costs for workers by producing geographies of low accessibility to jobs. All right. So I'm going to go back to chapter 3 in a minute, but just very briefly, I just want to, give you a little hint about the empirical chapters of the book. So in chapter 4, I'm mapping employment subcenters in Mexico City. And I do this because I want to identify the spatial distribution of the demand for labor, right? I wanted to look at where in the urban region are jobs located spatially. So this is an empirical study of the change of jobs concentrations in Greater Mexico City between 1999 and 2019. And I do this using microdata from the 1999 and 2019 economic census that was available from the Mexican Statistics Institute, which is a wonderful institution with great data. And I basically replicate a very well-established methodology in the field of economic geographies that is called the double threshold method, right? Developed by a couple of scholars from California in 1991. So please take a look at the chapter. I'm not going to stop a lot here. I'm going to continue, but if anyone is interested in seeing how we map job concentrations and how do we use these methodologies to identify shifts in the areas that concentrate employment, please take a look at the chapter. Chapter 5 is a chapter that I use for the study of housing, right? And I call it Housing Pathways and the Mobility Experience of Workers. So, I draw on the concept of housing pathways, which is a very well-established methodology to trace the housing routes that households and individuals take over time, right? And the goal of this methodology is to identify some ideal typologies of housing pathways that households go through in an urban region, right? And then I'm making the argument that these housing pathways are very closely linked and intertwined with the mobility experience of workers, right? So I base this chapter on 25 interviews and 4 focus groups in the area of study in Eastern Mexico City. And yeah, so the chapter identifies the emergence of what I'm calling default housing pathways, right? That are producing a very costly mobility experience for workers in the area of study of Eastern Mexico City. Basically, what I'm saying in this chapter is that the kind of housing that households can attain in this area of study it's linked to the kind of job that households are able to attain. And there's a relationship between the housing pathway and jobs in shaping the mobility experience of workers, right? So some workers are able to go through housing pathways that produce a low-cost commuting experience and, provides a very good quality of life in terms of commuting. But there's other kinds of workers that, given the jobs that they have very limited housing options. They have to go to peripheral areas in the urban region. And given that job concentrations are still concentrated in the central area of the region, they go through a very costly mobility experience, right? So again, I'm not going to stop a lot in this chapter, but if anyone is interested in this link between the housing pathway and the mobility experience, please take a look at the chapter. I can assure you it's an easy read and easy to follow. Chapter 6 is doing mapping the spatial distribution of something that I call public and common mobility resources, which is basically just the publicly funded transportation systems that, urban governments distribute and put at the disposal of workers, right? So I do this by doing an empirical analysis of the private and public nature of mobility resources. I build this chapter based on an analytical framework from the field of economics, the level of excludability and rivalry of consumption of goods and services. And basically what I'm saying is that, this is very well explained in the chapter, right, in the methodology section, but basically what I'm saying is that there's a few transport systems in cities that the price is so low that no one is going to be excluded from consumption from those public transport systems, and the services is enough so that no one is going to everyone is going to have a chance to use that transport system, right? That's what I call public mobility resources. No one can be excluded, and there's room for everyone. And then I map them, right? So I'm trying to map the best mobility resources in the city. And to my surprise, or, maybe not that surprising, it turns out that the best mobility resources in the urban region tend to overlap with existing employment subcenters, right? So it seems that public investment for, highly subsidized public transport is concentrated in the areas that have very high economic vitality to begin with, job concentrations in central areas of the city and a few corridors, but peripheral areas and areas with lower socioeconomic status and areas that don't offer enough jobs for the population, they have very little publicly funded transportation systems, right? So yeah, maybe this is not surprising, but anyway, I'm analyzing in this chapter how this was produced, right? And the policies that help explain this concentration of mobility resources in job concentrations. Again, please take a look at the chapter if anyone is interested in this methodology to map publicly funded mobility resources. All right, and I'm happy to talk about any of these in the Q&As, right? I'm not going to stop a lot here. I'm going to keep going because I want to stop here. This is where I do want to stop a little bit more. In the chapter 3, I do an empirical study of inequalities in the journey to work, right? I call it Diverging Mobility Situations of Workers in Greater Mexico City. And I do this by conducting a study of average time and distance in the journey to work by travel district. in Mexico City Metropolitan Zone. I'm using data from the 2017 Origin Destination Survey produced by INEGI, which is our statistics institute. And this is a wonderful survey that is representative at the level of travel districts. INEGI produced 194 different travel districts throughout the metropolitan region, and it provides a very granular and high resolution look at inequalities in commuting, right? So I'm building up that data. And the methodology is that I'm just replicating very well-established methodologies from scholars Nietzsky and Boschman, a study published in 2014 in the Annals of the American Association of Geographers. So I'm not reinventing the method here. I'm just following this very well-established methodology to map something that is called mobility situations. And it works like this, right? Please take a look at this diagram, and I'm going to explain it very easily. It's very simple. This methodology consists of calculating average commuting time in the journey to work and average distance in the journey to work for each of those 194 travel districts, right? So for each of those travel districts, we will have average commuting time and average travel distance, right? All right. And then I calculate the mean, right, for the entire metropolitan region, right? I get the mean of those 194 travel districts, and then I get a mean for, you know, the metropolitan region travel time and the metropolitan region travel distance. And then I look at each of the 194 travel districts, and I classify them according to whether they fall above the metropolitan mean or below the metropolitan mean in travel time and distance, right? So basically, if you look at the quadrant in the upper left, let's start with the lower left. So if a travel district has a commuting time that is below the metropolitan mean and a travel distance below the metropolitan mean, I call that a short commute, right? It's a short commute. It's both below the mean, right? In terms of time and distance. So it's a short commute. All right. But if the travel time and the travel distance are both above the metropolitan mean, right? Then I have the situation of the upper right quadrant, and I call that a long commute, right? It's a commute that it's above the average both in time and distance. So it's a long commute, right? But then it gets fun. Then it gets interesting because a travel district with an average distance above the metropolitan mean, but an average time below the metropolitan mean, right? A very long distance in a very short time. We call that a wormhole, right? This is an area of the city that, you know, even though they're far away, they're far away, they get to their job very fast, right? So we call them a wormhole. And a travel district that has a travel distance below the metropolitan mean, but a travel time above the metropolitan mean, we call that a transit hell, right? That is an area of the city that is closer to the jobs, right? So the distance is closer, but it takes them a lot of time to get from their residential location to their job. So even though they're closer, they need more time, right? For any reason. So we call that a transit hell. All right. So based on that classification of situations, I conducted the empirical study, right? This is a map of average travel time in the journey to work in Mexico City Metropolitan Zone. And no surprises here, right? Areas closer to the center of the metropolitan region and areas closer to jobs concentrations have lower commuting times. Areas farther away in peripheral areas have larger commuting times. But there's a few areas in peripheral zones that have very low commuting times, right? So you know, those are like, you know, areas to keep an eye on. Like, why is it that they're so far away from job concentrations, but they have such short commute times? All right. Then the second map is a map of commuting distance in the journey to work. Again, no surprises here, right? Like areas closer to the center of the metropolitan region and closer to job concentrations. And overlapping with transport systems, mass transport systems, you see that those blue lines in the map, those are the mass transport systems. Well, those are the areas with lower distance in the journey to work, right? And this is a bit more concentric as we go to peripheral areas. Workers in those zones have larger distance in the journey to work. All right, so I use those two maps, and then I classify each of the travel districts into those 4 categories of mobility situations that I was explaining, and I get a map like this. The areas in yellow are the short commutes, right? Commutes below both the average time and distance in the journey to work. The areas on green are the long commutes, right? Commutes above both time and distance in the journey to work. Then the areas in that like teal color, right, are the wormholes. And okay, no surprises here. These are areas that are farther away into the periphery of the region, and for some reason they get to their jobs fast. And then we have the dark blue areas, right? The navy blue areas, which are the transit hells. And they're kind of like a belt surrounding the short commute areas into the peripheral areas of Mexico City proper. Right? These are a few statistical tests of differences of average time and distance in the journey to work between these 4 categories of mobility situations. And I did find statistically significant differences in time and distance in some of the mobility situations, right? So for instance, average time in the short commutes, right? Average time in the journey to work is 56 minutes, but it takes 81 minutes in the long commute zones and 72 minutes in the transit health zones for people to get to their jobs, right? So huge differences. And distance as well, right? People in the short commutes area, on average, they travel 8.2 kilometers, but workers on the long commute areas, they travel 16.3 kilometers, and folk in the transit hells, they travel 10.4 kilometers. So huge differences in commuting time and distance in these 4 categories, and differences are statistically significant. And then lastly, and this is the last map that I'm going to show, this is my area of study, right? Then I took a closer look into Eastern Mexico City, and as you can see, most of my area of study is comprised of long commutes areas. There's a few transit hells, and there's only 2 travel districts that can be classified as short commutes. This is the first empirical chapter of the book. This is chapter 3. And then I use this as the starting point for the analysis of the other chapters, right? Chapter 4 tries to explain why is it that we don't see important job concentrations in this area of study in Eastern Mexico City. Chapter 5 looks at housing pathways and how is it that some default housing pathways keep pushing workers farther away into the peripheral area of Eastern Mexico City. And then chapter 6 looks at transport policy, right? As you can see in this map in the right, the lines are representing mass transport systems. And you can see that my area of study has very few mass transport systems that go into that area, right? So I try to explain why is it that this area of the urban region is so transport deprived, And then I take a comprehensive look at all the empirical chapters, and I go to the conclusions and propose the choiceless mobility hypothesis, right, which is the entire point of the book. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Sorry if I touch on the book like pretty much on the surface. I didn't want to go like, into too deep in detail, but here's the way to, identify the book. Already available in the UIC library in the digital version. And there's my email and my office. And yeah, let's open it up for Q&As, and thank you for the space.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Jocelyn speaking. Thank you so much, Dr. López-García. I want to thank you for your presentation and really sharing your research with us today. We do have a couple of questions for you, but I also want to remind everyone and invite the audience to post your questions on the chat or raise your hand under the reaction button on Zoom, so I may call on you to unmute your mic. We do have about 15 minutes or so for questions. And one of the first questions that stands out to us would be about wormholes, right? Can you share a little bit more about why these wormholes exist? And also, would you say that these wormholes represent commuting ideals to replicate here in the US?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Well, I think that different wormholes could be explained for different reasons. And, I'm actually in the process of publishing a new paper precisely on that question, like what explains the likelihood of experiencing a specific mobility situation. It's a paper that I sent to a peer-reviewed journal that specializes in urban studies, and I'm in the peer review process, is in second review. So it's about to get published soonish, and basically the wormholes are explained by the proximity of job concentrations. Maybe people in these wormholes, as you can see, they're in peripheral areas, right? And what I found is that people in these areas, they're not commuting to the main employment concentrations of the metropolitan region. Like, let's say, to make like the analogy with Chicago, they're not commuting to downtown, right, to the Loop. They're commuting to some other place that concentrates jobs. And even though they're farther away, in terms of distance to the journey to work, traffic is less congested in those areas, right? And public transport is able to get faster to job concentrations that are in peripheral areas. So it's a combination of less traffic, less congestion, and living in closer proximity to job concentrations. And I will say yes. I will say that we do want to find ways to produce more wormholes, even in the US. We do want to find ways to, connect people to job concentrations that are decentralized, right? Not everyone has to come to the Loop. I mean, yes, but if we could, if economic development policy could produce job concentrations in other areas closer to where people live, and if we, match that with more efficient transport systems that connect people faster from their places of origin to their places of work, we could produce more wormholes. And I think this is desirable as a policy goal.
Thank you for that answer. And I do have a follow-up question for that, but first I'll go to Ignacio.
Hey, Ignacio.
Hola, David.
Hola.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I'm super excited to hear everything that is coming out from your research, book, and papers, and so on.
Thank you.
I want to follow up with the wormhole situation, and this might be super tangential to your work, but I'm just curious if along the process of your research, have you had conversations or reach out with policymakers, the city government, city officials, of like, what do they want to do? Like, from a theoretical standpoint, we can suggest wormholes are good, or we could decentralize where people go to work. But like, yeah, is there a push of
central Mexican officials to do more wormholes, more metros, more transit areas, or like decentralized jobs?
Right. Thank you, Ignacio, for the question and for your generous comments. So look, I am still in the process of showing around my results, right? And I do have a couple of colleagues in Mexico City that want to organize a few talks with policymakers in Mexico City so that I can present these results and then have a conversation about policies. And you know, if at all my engagement with policymakers so far has been as interviewees for my research, right? So I'm learning from what they say and from their experience, but I'm still not like making any recommendations for them, right? At least in that stage of doing the research. And when I do, when I finally have a chance to sit with policymakers in Mexico and explain these results, and if I'm asked about policy recommendations, I'm gonna suggest that we should, you know, as a policy goal, we should aim to produce more wormholes and more short commute areas, and we should aim to eradicate the long commute areas and the transit helps, right? If we're able to do that as a policy goals, we might be able to reduce inequalities in the commuting experience of workers and get closer to an urban area that is more fair for everyone, right? A little bit more just and equitable. Now, how to do that? I'm still in the process of publishing research here, but you know, there's a widespread agreement in policy maker circles and even in circles of scholars that the best way to reduce inequalities in commuting is through transport policy, right? This is like a widespread understanding, right? And it's like intuitive and it makes sense, right? So, okay, commuting, your trip to work, all right, well, transport, right? Like it's very intuitive to think in that way. But what I'm finding in my research is that not necessarily, not always. Actually, when I run models and I run my statistical analysis to investigate what explains the likelihood of experiencing any of these mobility situations, transport-related variables are often not significant in my models, or if they are, they have very low explanatory power in the models. And there's other kinds of variables that seem to have a larger weight in explaining the mobility situations. For example, land use related variables, right? Job density, distance to job concentrations has more explanatory power than transport. And furthermore, socioeconomic related variables like educational attainment, the percentage of indigenous population in Mexico City, socioeconomic status, specific characteristics of housing, household-related characteristics have the biggest weight in explaining the likelihood of experiencing each of these mobility situations. So yes, it is about transport and that's fine, but it's more than that. It's also about reducing socioeconomic inequalities so that more people can escape the housing pathways that are putting them in these costly mobility situations, increase educational attainment so that people have access to better paying jobs that allows them to have a better housing, and also housing policies, right, that allow the lower income population to buy housing units closer to employment concentrations. So it's a very complex policy discussion, right? It's not just about transport, it's about many other kinds of policies that are interacting in producing these situations. But I appreciate the question a lot, Ignacio.
Thank you so much. And my follow-up question was regarding inequalities to like accessibility and jobs. And so I'm glad that you're already touching on how that's related. But I'm wondering if you can speak to sort of the role of environmental and climate justice within transportation policy.
Right. Well, I'm not sure if I can speak about the role of environmental injustices in transport policy because that's not my area. So I couldn't speak about that. But what I could say is that what I have found in my research in terms of accessibility to jobs is that there's a very close link between environmental injustices, housing prices, and the mobility experience of workers, because it is often the case that places that suffer from environmental injustices, ranging from pollution to lack of quality public space to lack of transport, tend to have lower housing prices. And therefore the lower income population tends to, that's the only attainable housing stock for the lower income population. In these areas, they also tend to be farther away in peripheral areas. In the case of Latin American cities, cities in the US are different, right? But Latin American cities, peripheral areas are the lower income areas. And they're usually transport deprived. So it's kind of like a vicious cycle. You see the lower income population that for some reason is unable to attain better paying jobs, ends up in the worst housing stock, which is usually located in peripheral areas, farther away from employment concentrations, and deprived of transport systems, right? Whereas conversely, the higher income population tends to afford the higher, the higher prices of housing stock located closer to job concentrations, which, as I have shown in my research, and I show this in the book, they also tend to have better publicly funded transport systems, right? So it's kind of like a virtuous cycle for the better off population, for the better off workers, and a vicious cycle for the worse off workers. And for some reason, policymakers have not been able to, like put the finger in this complexity and devise policies that are able to stop these trends, right? Like housing policy is just thinking about housing, but not a lot about transport of jobs. Economic development policy is thinking about jobs, but not a lot about housing of transport. Or transport policy is thinking about how to make transport efficient, but not a lot of discussion about jobs or housing. So, and that's what I'm trying to do with my work, right? I'm trying to integrate these fields so that we can devise policy alternatives that, tackle this issue in a more comprehensive way.
Yes, and we can definitely see how they're all intertwined. And so I want to thank you for really doing those visuals and going over that explanation. I am looking at the time and we only have a couple minutes, unfortunately. We had so much to cover, so many topics. And you've also given us plenty to continue thinking about throughout the events and even after. But I do want to read the chats. This is probably the last question. If you do have more questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll probably send them to you. But the question says, and they're also thanking you so much for the compelling talk and sharing about your book. So the question is, can you speak to the implications of the pandemic and the increase in remote work or working from home in the context of the distance between people and jobs in the metropolitan areas?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jocelyn. And thank you for your comments and question, Boris. So look, there's many people doing very serious research about the implications of the pandemic for accessibility to jobs, but I'm not one of those people, right? So take what I'm going to say with a pinch of salt because I'm not doing research in this field. But my take on this, or what I think is happening, is that and I'm going to talk about the case of specifically about the case of Mexico City, right, which is where I've done most of my research. It seems to me that very few workers were able to continue with their job telecommuting from doing home office. Like, not every single job can be done remotely, right? There's many jobs that need the face-to-face interaction to continue to exist, like any manufacturing job, right, in a manufacturing line, or in any kind of service sector that, you know, needs to provide a service to someone. And very few jobs are able to be performed remotely, right? High quality jobs in the service sector, usually in very high productive, you know, highly productive economic activities, usually in global value chains, right? And not everyone has access to that. So what I'm trying to say is that the commuting experience changed for very few people, but not for many, right? Especially in the case of Mexico City, where the safety net is so poor, right, that if someone doesn't go to perform their economic activity, they will not have an income, right? There's no unemployment insurance, and there's no COVID relief, and like, no, there's nothing. Mexico is really a place with very poor and sad social safety net, right? And the last thing I want to say is that it seems to me that the people that, you know, who gets to perform one of those jobs that can be done remotely, at least in the case of Mexico City, is highly mediated by socioeconomic status and also by racial issues. We don't like to talk a lot in Mexico about racial issues, like people feels very uncomfortable with this conversation, but there's a lot of racial issues and who gets what kind of job. And there's a lot of discrimination in terms, you know, racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically. So like the short answer is only the better off population to begin with, and you know, the privileged population seems to me was able to perform those jobs that could be done remotely, whereas the worse off population to begin with had to keep commuting, right, just risking their life and not a lot of change. But again, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm just, you know, sharing my thoughts on this.
Thank you again. And we do see the comments in the chats, people reflecting on the policies and the different systems and sort of the resemblance with Chicago, and also the reflection on the commuting and the transits. There's also a comment in the chat. It says, I heard there's about 1.6 million Americans now living and working remotely in Mexico City, wondering how that is also impacting the commuter mobility in the future. So we hope to see a lot more research coming out around this and the generational impact that it might have. But once again, we want to thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. And thank you all for joining us today for today's public program. To everyone in the space, please join me in thanking our speaker by unmuting yourselves, using the chat reaction buttons. Thank you so much. I hope you can all join us in our next Radical Research from BIPOC Scholars presentation scheduled for Wednesday, March 8th at 3 p.m. with Dr. Gabriela Nunez-Mir from Biological Sciences. You can register for this and other events hosted by the LCC on our website, where you can also find the recording of this presentation in the coming days. And so this brings our program to a close. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you have a lovely day, and we'll post links in the chat as well to access all of this. Thanks again, and take care.
I had a lot of fun. Thanks everyone for the questions.
Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
David.